Very much. Hello everybody and thanks for coming today. So first we're going to have a bit of a recap over the federal election, and then we're going to have a look at three areas. The first is lessons from the past, then we'll have a look at obstacles to legalisation, and thirdly, is there light at the end of the tunnel? So let's start with the federal election. So this headline tells the story. Legalise Cannabis rides high in Senate vote as grassroots campaign pays off. Thursday, when I last checked, there was a total of 413,225 people across Australia had given cannabis a primary vote in the Senate. And let's have a look at Queensland. So here you can see a screenshot in the early stages. And when I took the shot, Legalise Cannabis was only just trailing Pauline Hanson's One Nation and ahead of Palmer's United Australia. Now keep in mind that Cannabis only spent $10,000 on this campaign and Palmer spent about $70 million. So at this stage in the count, it really looked like we were in with a shot of taking Hanson's seat. Now this is the count on Thursday, and unfortunately what's happened here is we've fallen back a little bit. And the reason we've fallen back a bit is basically because postal votes have come in and started to be counted. And postal votes are generally conservative, so that's why this has happened. But having a look at what 5% here, 5.1%, what that means in raw numbers is that 135,510 people in Queensland alone voted for cannabis, put a 1 next to legalise cannabis. Now, I just want to go back a bit just to talk about preferences. Now, as I mentioned, across Australia at this point, we've received over 400,000 primary votes. Now, again, that's the people who put 1 in the box. We haven't had a chance yet to see how many people have put a 2, a 3, 4 or a 5 in the box. So 400,000 is only just a part of the picture. Once the Electoral Commission enters all of the ballot papers into their system, and that's still a week or maybe a couple of weeks away, what will happen is that they'll do what's called the button press. And that's the start of the process that calculates all of the preferences. And that's where the parties with the least number of votes start to get eliminated, and the preferences, again as determined by the voters, start to get piled on top of the next party, the one that they put the 2 onwards. So just looking at this, and I can't see distances. So again, with animal justice, for example, say, for example, when animal justice gets eliminated, say half of the voters that voted 1 for animal justice put a 2 against legalised cannabis. What that means is 0.6 of the animal justice, well, half of those votes then get piled on top of legalised cannabis. So that then takes us to 5.7%. And this goes on and on while all the preferences are distributed. And that's actually how Senate seats are determined. So here, like I say, I can't see us catching up to Hanson. But what's important is it does give us a level of insight into the support that cannabis gets, because 400,000 is only one part of the story. So across Australia, that number could end up at 500,000. But that's still only part of the story. So looking at this screen, for example, you'll see that the Lib Nats have received 35.7% of the vote. And Queensland's a pretty good example here, because 35.7 here represents about 1 million votes. And on the right-hand side, you can see it equates to what's called 2.5 quotas. And that's just a technical term for saying 2.5 Senate seats. So that means 400,000 primary votes wins a seat, 800,000 votes wins them the 2 seats. And with those 800,000 votes, there's no need to distribute preferences, because those 800,000 have been used to elect the 2 people at the top of the ticket. But the point is that we don't know how many people out of those 800,000 actually put a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 against legalised cannabis. So consider across the country how many people whose vote would have got someone elected straight off the bat, but they might have given cannabis a preference. There could literally have been about 1 million people that have actually put a number against legalised cannabis. So back to Queensland. Here we go. This is my favourite slide of the entire election, I've got to say. So I want to have a closer look at Queensland, because at the previous election in 2019, One Nation received 10.3% of the vote, and cannabis, or hemp as it was known back then, received 1.8%. Now at this election, One Nation drops back to 7.2, knocking a full 3 percentage points off their primary. And cannabis goes from 1.8 to 5.1. And in actual fact, when I looked yesterday, it got up to 5.2. Now, it's much too simplistic, and it'd be wrong for me to say that whole 3% came across from One Nation. But I can tell you, I reckon a decent chunk did. And this is really important, because sometimes people say to me, oh, legalise cannabis, you're just cannibalising the Greens votes. Well, that's wrong. And you can see that it's wrong. And I can also demonstrate that it's wrong, because in 2019, when the Hemp Party got eliminated, we can see who the voters gave their next preference to, because we can see the preference flow data from the Electoral Commission. And the preferences go off into all directions. In fact, the distribution of preferences are pretty much divided between the Nats, the Nationals, the Shooters, the Greens, and One Nation. So the point is, cannabis gets votes from people from all different political persuasions. So I can see Michael's here again, and I can see Gail, thank you very much, and Suzette. I mean, Michael runs the Legalise Cannabis Party, and he was the head candidate for this, and Gail and Suzette and everyone that's been candidates and volunteers for this movement. I mean, you've got to take your hat. I want to give them a clap, because seriously, anyone that actually does this, it takes a lot of guts to stand up and actually, and get out there and get onto those booths and say that you're standing up for cannabis. Another milestone I just want to quickly touch on at this election is the fact that the ABC Vote Compass app asked people whether or not they would support legalising cannabis. This is my answer. But the important thing is, 1.5 million people during this election actually were asked this question. Combining how we went in this election, plus things like Vote Compass, plus all the media, this sort of stuff really brings cannabis up to the top of people's mind. I mean, it is just so important. So that's the main point that I want to make about the federal election. And now I want to actually move on to lessons from the past. So I've watched the medicinal cannabis industry from the start, and I'm also a medicinal cannabis user. I've got a type of neuralgia that gives me pain down the side of my face, and I get some mad migraines. Early on, I was treated with a cocktail of drugs, and they included endone. And one day when I was in Canada, I was walking down the street and had to do a double take, because there was a shop. And this was the shop. It was the Green Panda dispensary. It looked like a cake shop from outside, but I went out and I went in and found out they sell edibles. So that sounds good. And I said, I'll have a couple. And they said, well, hang on, you're a patient? I said, well, no. I said, well, and I said, but I've got, so I had an MRI on my phone. I showed them the scan. They said, oh, that's good enough for us. So, as you can see, very high tech. On the spot, with the texter, I get a card, I get a number, 1340. It's a bit dog-eared now, but I carry it in my wallet. It's one of my most treasured possessions. So, back in Australia, medical cannabis is legal. And I badgered my GP to give me a script, and she didn't want to know about it. And why would she want to know about it? I mean, the amount of red tape that it would have entailed for her to do. And also all of the training would have told her, cannabis is bad, right? So it took me ages to convince her, but finally she did agree to give me a script for medical cannabis. And on her own time, she went about going through all the bullshit with the SASP applications and everything else. And then I get a script, which is fantastic. So I go to a chemist. I went to 2 chemists, and both of them looked at me like I was a criminal. It was embarrassing and it was demeaning. But I finally did get a chemist, and I finally did get the product. But after a hell of a lot of mucking around and hundreds of dollars later, it was a nightmare. And what I went through, I know, is nothing compared to what thousands and thousands and thousands of patients in this country have to go through every day. And how so many of them can't afford to go through this legal route anyway. And I'm just going to say that is bullshit. What I need to be able to do is just get in my car and go to my Green Panda dispensary, hopefully one that's owned by a local boutique grower, I should be able to walk in there. There should be dozens of cannabis varieties on the wall or on the counter, and I should be able to say to a knowledgeable bud tender, hey, like last week, I got a bit stressed from the cannabis I used, or can you change it up? And I need to know that I'm dealing with someone who knows what cannabis is all about. So what's happened with cannabis in this country is a textbook example of how politicians and bureaucrats can totally stuff it up. It's the result of trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. Now, Dean Natale was right with his regulator of medicinal cannabis bill, because the TGA is just totally unsuited to deal with cannabis medicines. So the only solution is to legalise it. Because again, I want to go down to Green Panda, whether or not I've got a freight train running through my head, a migraine that's knocked me on my ass, or I just want to sit in front of the telly that night and watch some Netflix. So let's move on to some of the obstacles that we face. Firstly, a lot of people actually say, hey, let's just legalise it. Look how much tax they're going to make. Have a look at Colorado, make $1 billion. $1 billion in tax revenues. What we need to understand is that the Australian system is very different to the US. Being able to legalise and raise taxes from a legal cannabis market is probably the single most powerful thing that's driving the state-by-state legalisation in the US. But unlike the US, Australian states can't impose a tax on cannabis. Section 90 of our Constitution explicitly states that only the federal government can put a tax on products, and that includes cannabis. And I've been working with a constitutional lawyer on this, a guy named Patrick Kaiser, and he argues constitutional cases in front of the High Court all the time. What we were trying to do is to see if we couldn't get a legalised cannabis regime going, and if we couldn't use tax dollars to entice some of these state politicians to give them some incentive to get behind us. Patrick ended up doing so much work on it, he actually wrote a paper. And in a nutshell, what this says is that states can't tax cannabis. And he argues, like I just said, that because states can't tax cannabis, there's less incentive for them to legalise. Taxing cannabis can only happen at the federal level. So we need to give states another reason to legalise. There's going to be lots of money to be saved. Of course, there's less money on cops, less money in the court system, and the prisons and so on. But the only time there'll be tax revenues is when the legalisation is at both the federal and at the state level. And we need to realise that, remember it. But just for the record, I don't mind a cannabis tax, as long as it's fair, as long as it's not over the top, and as long as it goes to schools and hospitals, right? I also don't mind a cannabis tax if it's going to speed up the whole process of getting it legalised. But here's another obstacle, these two mugs. Major parties, Labor and Liberal. Seriously, it's a matter of tweedledum and tweedledee. They're so concerned about winning elections, they're shit scared of going anywhere near cannabis policy or drug policy. Neither of them wants to be painted as soft on drugs. So that's why you never hear either of them talking about it during election campaigns. And it's a travesty. But there are big changes happening in politics. I'll make sure there's big changes happening in politics. I'll get to that in a minute. Because the voters are deserting the major parties in droves. But I just want to go off on a tangent a little bit and talk about roadside drug testing. So there's the Cake Fairman bill currently in New South Wales Parliament, and it's currently now at the moment in front of an inquiry. So I've got a little bit of experience in this area because I've actually worked on it in Victoria. Victoria's been trying to find a solution for many, many years. Unfortunately, Cake's bill is going to run up against the same roadblocks that we have in Victoria. And one of those roadblocks is in respect to determining the amount of THC that's in your system. It's right there in the bill. And I'll convert the legalese into plain English. It says, the THC was obtained and administered in accordance with your prescription. Now, how the hell is that going to work? And the New South Wales government, they've come straight out and said it won't work. It's right there on page 11 of their submission to the inquiry. And it says, and again I quote, to reliably determine the concentration of THC, a blood sample would have to be taken by a driver, by any driver who wants to use medicinal cannabis and be reviewed by an expert. It goes on to say, a person seeking to rely on any exemption would need to be taken to a hospital or other prescribed place for samples to be taken by an authorised sample taker. Are you kidding me? Right? I'd have a defence, but I've got to go and have someone stick a needle in my arm, right? That's no defence at all, and that doesn't give me any confidence to drive, so I'm just going to pop it in there. Simple as that. And that's why we can't stop fighting until we've got a sensible solution. And that sensible solution is a test for impairment. And that test for impairment has to be at the roadside. And they do it in the US. It's called a standardised field sobriety test. So I support Kate's bill. It's a start. It's better than nothing. But we can't stop fighting until the test is for impairment, not presence. So we've certainly got obstacles. Some are bigger than others. We've got to just keep fighting and banging away until we find solutions. So lastly, is there light at the end of the tunnel? What we need to do is focus on legalising and regulating cannabis at a state level. And I really believe that if we can get just one state to legalise, then the federal government will pass legislation so cannabis can be taxed a little. And once that happens, all the states will follow. They'll all follow in the line. Maybe it's the ACT. They may not have to go too much further. Hopefully it's New South Wales. Yeah. So I just want to talk about the Greens here for a little bit. I referred to them about us being accused of cannibalising their vote. Because you may be thinking, why do we need a Legalise Cannabis Party when we have the Greens? The Greens have got a policy on cannabis, right? And I agree they do. They've got lots of other policies in lots of other areas. But it all comes down to priorities. I'm as keen for koalas as the next bloke, right? You know, I want to save the rainforests. I want to save the Great Barrier Reef. But right at the moment, what worries me the most is kids getting busted for smoking some weed and getting a record that will affect them for the rest of their life. What worries me is that people who need cannabis as a medicine, but they can't afford it because the system's against it. People on disability pensions, some of the most vulnerable people in our society. I worry about people losing their driver's licences because they take cannabis instead of endos. We've got an opiate crisis. People are dying from prescription opiates, for Christ's sake. We need to be using as many policy levers as possible to move people away from opiates. No one's ever died from a cannabis overdose. So, yes, the Greens do have cannabis policies, but how high is cannabis law reform on their agenda? So having a legalised cannabis party does two things. One, we can get elected to the parliament and really push cannabis every single day. But in addition to that, it puts pressure on the Greens to bring the drug law reform and cannabis law reform to the top of their list of priorities. They need to make drug law reform a higher priority. And this is what we see. So this is in West Australia. This is Sophia Mormon, and this is our first legalised cannabis MP that we got elected. And in WA, we got two elected. The second one is Dr. Brian Walker, who's the most compassionate man. If you haven't heard his maiden speech, I highly recommend having a look at it on YouTube. And after we did this in March last year, we saw the Greens talking about cannabis again, right? But they went quiet at the federal election. I didn't hear one mention of drug law reform from the Greens the entire election. So coming back to the federal election, there is a massive shift. This is, again, light on the end of the tunnel, because there's a massive shift going on with politics in the country. This is the makeup of the next parliament, and as you can see, Labor only has a majority of one. There's 16 people on the crossbench. And of those 16 people, by far the majority of them are progressives. Off the top of my head, I can only think of one of them, and that's Bob Katter. So voters are sick of the major parties. And here's a chart which shows it. The combined vote for the two major parties has been falling, and it's steadily falling. And it's going to keep falling. And it's going to keep going down. And more independents are going to be elected. And more minor parties are going to be elected. And legalised cannabis MPs are going to be elected. And it gives us a hope and a pathway. because it means that we're going to have a way to force governments and drag them across the line to get some important progressive social reforms achieved. And I want to give you an example. Now, voluntary assisted dying. Now, I know it's a bit of a downer, but just stick with me here for a second. So, voluntary assisted dying laws that would give suffering, dying people the right to choose to end their suffering has been a political minefield for decades. Neither Labor or the Coalition want to touch it. But only a few weeks ago, Alex Greenwich, who's an independent MP in New South Wales, managed to achieve what no Labor or Liberal government wanted to go near, and that was to get the VAD law passed. The passage of the VAD law in New South Wales is a result of years and years of work from advocates lobbying, writing letters, signing petitions. And then they convinced Alex to champion their cause in Parliament. So what's important here is all those people standing behind Alex, they're not only the advocates, but they're also parliamentarians from other parties. There's Adam Searle from Labor. There's Kate Fairman from the Greens. There's Emma Hurst from Animal Justice. There are other independents here. They're all co-sponsors. But this all came about after hundreds and hundreds of hours of behind-the-scenes meetings and lobbying and convincing people of the merits of the reform. So getting stuff done in politics is not about grand speeches in Parliament. In actual fact, that's probably the most minute part of getting stuff done in politics. In fact, the real work goes behind the scenes. It's about lots and lots of hard work, convincing lots and lots of people to support your cause. And that's what we need to do to get cannabis legalised. We need to campaign hard at every election. Over 400,000 people voted one for cannabis at this election. And maybe double that gave us a 2 or a 3, or like I said, up to a 6. People really want cannabis legalised. So just to wrap up, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but everyone's got to pitch in. We've got to normalise cannabis use, you know. We've got to make people realise that cannabis is no different than having a glass of wine or a beer at the end of the day. And we've also got to remember that it's a hell of a lot better than having an endone or a Valium. So what can we all do? Well, we need people to join our party, we need people to volunteer, and we also need people to donate. But everyone, if you can all become advocates for cannabis, because we need to keep working to get rid of this stigma. So it's just a plan, and it's time to legalise. So thank you.